Hello, in this video I want to continue the series that we've been doing, talking a little bit about racial capitalism on the intellectual property protections topic. That will be the September and October topic for the Lincoln Douglas 2021 resolution. I think that it's a really interesting argument from all angles to this resolution, and if you haven't, I would definitely suggest either watching the last video that I did or the intro to racial capitalism on intellectual property protections, because I think that it's a really good way to think about some of what the bases are for the conversation that we'll be having in this video about the specific strengths that I think really come from this type of argument, and the way that I really want to apply that to the link debate, the permutation debate, impact comparison, alternative debating. I would say that if you have like a very small understanding of racial capitalism, or this is your first time hearing that term, you should definitely go back to when I first did the series on racial capitalism and water, or when I was doing the racial capitalism series around the water resolution, because there I do some of my bare basic ideas over what I think racial capitalism is, how it's defined and used in various types of literature, and some of the best places I think to find it in literature. And in these videos I really just want to work on applying it to the specific resolution that's in front of you, to kind of make them unique and different, so that it doesn't feel like these videos are doing the same type of thing over and over again, and that it really feels like it's something for this particular type of resolution and what you should be doing. So in the last video, a lot of the stuff that we kind of talked about in terms of what would be a more strategic way to do a lot of this stuff, we were talking about the ways in which the link debate and the permutation debate can all kind of be dictated by some of the conversations that we were having on the framing of thesis portions from the video before, about how we kind of want to shift maybe a lot of the debate that we're having to the way in which they're investing in certain advantages and certain values that come from their advantages, that kind of basically make it harder for them to centralize the debate around the plain text, which I think is always kind of where you want to be, where it feels like there's a little bit hard, is a hard find to ask in terms of trying to get a really complete set of literature based and link arguments that you can really find on the resolution. And I think in that case you can really go into a lot of that, what I think will be a lot of the generic advantages that people kind of rush towards, and use that against them by using some of the tools before that. And I think that when you're generally just trying to think about how you should be using the link debate as a whole, the link debate I think should be a place where you're really establishing implementation of what we were kind of using from the video before, about how you kind of want to frame the debate, and literally kind of showing the judge how that looks in the way that you're applying it within a speech context. I think that within a 2 and C or a 2 and R, the places that you should be really looking to make the most effect with this criticism, as in a negative kind of standpoint, I think the link debate is a place where you can be these are the exact ways in which the 1AC has invested in a particular pathology or a particular relationship towards how we should identify ourselves within a world of international intellectual property rights, and the way in which that kind of changes the world order and the World Trade Organization, and how that is also dictates various types of basically passive forms of colonialism that look different in the way that they show themselves today. And I think that the way that you can kind of see this both as something that you would frame as an epistemological question, but also as a material question, and I think that that allows you to get a little bit of wiggle room in terms of how specific you really want to get into the effects of the actual plan, versus how much you want to get into just the overall justification for how the plan is able to kind of think of politics in the field of politics as a whole, especially when we were kind of talking about those base amount of link arguments that you'll definitely need in terms of the types of arguments that you'll need in terms of just being able to win things like the way in which they attempt to create a general survivability for the world population, the way in which they assume that there is this kind of necessity for the white savior scientists in the context of medicine, etc., all create various points of tension in the affirmative, where you're trying to make an argument not just about the whole that a particular type of idea or elevation of a particular type of culture does for the project of colonialism or the project of capitalism, but what it does in terms of creating a division between how various people are kind of oriented, represented, and dictated in a world of racial capitalism, and the way that it affects international politics, and the way the kind of local and globals fill into each other. I think doing a lot of internal linked work to see why there's a kind of bigger implication, or not even a bigger implication, but just a large implication overall to the way in which these types of representations spill out into global politics, is a really good place for you to build really strong example work, and I think generally just to add a lot of texture to your arguments. I think then when you're kind of transitioning this into what you think you want your permutation answers to be or what you want your permutation responses to be I think a lot of the arguments that you kind of want to make are why the kind of world ordering that they have basically requires the cementation destruction or the destruction of the ability for us to think about resistance or an economic system outside of capitalism, that the continued reliance on capitalism for how we dictate things like bare necessities, medicine, etc., ultimately builds it as the only way in which we are like able to culturally and politically envision how we exist in the world, because it becomes a way in which we are simultaneously erasing the other types of alternatives that people have to things like capitalism. And I think that the way that you kind of want to make it is that they're kind of use a political imagination to cement the international scale as it does now. It makes it kind of like impossible for that global effort to happen. And in my opinion, I think there are a lot more like a lot more trade-off arguments that make more sense in terms of like how the way in which we kind of form and think about politics at various types of local levels basically decides our ability to create global forms of solidarity. And the kind of like 1AC's attempt to permute the negative alternative is an attempt to basically confold like global activism and global resistance into like global institutions and like the regimes that they encompass. And I think that could be a really good place for you to kind of build a series of offense about how this historically has been implicated in various ways in which like institutions, like rules, laws, and regulations have been implemented in order to fill in the gap for what like activists and other groups are attempting to demand, but ultimately basically feedback into the same structures that are producing those various types of exploitation. I then think when you go into the place like impact comparison and for the alternative, I think that it's a really interesting set of debates to be having, because I think that when you go to the impact comparison portion of the debate, I think that a lot of teams, when they're reading stuff that feels like closer to a cap cave, their ultimate jump is to extinction. But I actually think that you kind of noting extinction as kind of a secondary concern to all of the kind of like moral dilemmas for how the way in which they order the world brings us closer to extinction, just by breaking down the ability for us to have a global pattern to resist outside of these institutions, can be a really interesting place where you kind of speak to and once again feed in some of these internal link struggles that aren't even really struggles, but are places where I think are like opportunities for you to build really strong argumentation when you're trying to show the way in which various types of impacts that are kind of like thought of at like a top level scale when you're thinking of things like hedge or the econ impacts, etc., that kind of like move closer to these warlike impacts, the way in which they're basically used in order to justify colonialism in the name of at least some people continue to live, at least the people that matter are continue to able to live. And I think that when you're able to show that that is part of the ethic that the alternative resists, it also helps you prove some of the offense that you want to push on the permutation. And having these things really feel like they're working together and making that coherent story is how you get that original kind of framing argument that we started with to really continually apply all the way into when you get to the alternative. And then you can make a lot of arguments about how the changes in method and the ways in which the method is able to be rearticulated across different type of contexts for different type of local populations, and how they find commonality in the types of struggles that they find, the types of things that they resist against, and the struggles that they're kind of like in communion for. I think really change the terms in which we think about how alternatives are kind of like not really supposed to be places that are able to immediately fiat and ameliorate all of the problems of the world, but are a starting point for a different way to envision the role of politics, which requires us to like change the way in which we're using debate and think about the relationship between debate and its direct relationship to politics, which I definitely think is something like really interesting to question when you're talking about like an international level resolution. Is definitely a place where this particular criticism I think finds a lot of really interesting things to talk about. Hopefully you find this video helpful, and hopefully you'll tune in for more videos that I'll be doing talking about racial capitalism on intellectual property protections. And yeah, thanks.